Welcome to the Classical Spookfest, an annual descent into the terrifying hellscape of classical music. I'm your host, Willy's White, and with me are Tiffany, Boo, and KENSHO Watanabe. Today we'll dissect one of the spookiest works in the repertoire, Camille Saint-Saëns Danse Macabre. And then we'll have an interview with mortician, author, and YouTube deathfluencer Caitlin Doughty. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment in D minor. So, KENSHO, what do we have today?
Alrighty, thank you, Willies. This week, we'll be playing a round of the deadliest game, Classical Chronology. Okay, here's how this works. I'm going to play clips of 3 pieces from different points in music history that share a common feature. My co-hosts don't know what any of the pieces are, but it's their job to put them in chronological order just by listening to them. This week, the 3 pieces are united by the fact that they all include reference to the Roman Catholic chant for the dead, the Dies Irae. Before we start, let's discuss what the Dies Irae is and what it sounds like.
Dies irae, dies illa, salve segum in favilla.
So the Dies Irae is a Gregorian chant, speaks of the day of wrath, and the words themselves are quite terrifying if you just look up the translation. I mean, I'll tell you the first stanza, which is, the day of wrath, that day will dissolve the world in ashes. And it goes on to talk about all the quaking of the earth when the judgment is about to come.
Yeah, and I think that, the original context is also super important. Yeah, I mean, it's a Gregorian chant, but specifically it is part of a sequence that's used at funeral rites. So that's why it has this, in addition to the text, that's why it's so closely associated with the dead, the macabre, mourning rituals, stuff like that.
But it's interesting that of all things that talk about dead, in our literary and musical history, that this is the one that's been taken from its original ecclesiastical roots. I mean, and this is a religious text, and then put into all manner of compositions, including the one that we're taking a look at today, which is decidedly not a particularly religious take on that text.
Right, and actually, we should mention that we'll link in the show notes a link to an episode of this great podcast called 20,000 Hertz, where they recently did a whole episode on the Dies Irae chant and how it's been recycled through classical and popular music. And I would really, if people like our show, they would probably really like that episode.
It's an awesome podcast. Okay, KENSHO, we're ready for our game here.
Alrighty, here is excerpt number 1. All right, here is clip number 2. And here is clip number 3. Alrighty, so 3 quite different renditions of the Dies Irae. What are our initial thoughts?
The first clip is Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances, and I don't think I'm tipping...
I don't think that is right. But I do agree that it is Rachmaninoff.
Is it the Third Symphony? No, Isle of the Dead.
No, it's not Isle of the Dead. It's not Symphonic Dances. I know what it's not because I didn't recognize it right off. But I did hear it as Rachmaninoff, which is evident for me in the instrumentation as it does the build-up, because it sounds exactly like the Paganini variations, the variations on a theme by Paganini.
Ah, maybe that's what it is.
It's not that, because I know that piece backwards and forwards. It's not the Symphonic Dances. It's not Symphony No. 2.
Well, I don't know number 1 at all, and I know number 3 very well, so it's got to be Symphony No. 3.
The other thing that came to mind for me that is a piece that I know uses it, but I don't know very well, is the bells.
It would have been obvious. It would have been obvious I played like the next 3 seconds.
Well, that gives it away then. That gives it away because the bells is a choral piece, so that's probably what he's talking about.
Or not.
So
I mean, it's one or the other, right? So and I will say I didn't recognize it, and I don't know either of those two pieces. So that makes sense to me. Both of those things make sense to me.
I'm going to go with the bells, which is a setting of poetry translated into Russian by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, so the bells is like, oh boy, I want to say like 1927 would be my guess for that piece.
I don't have a guess. This is a really hard game for me because I'm very bad with years. And we're right at a point in history, I think, where referential writing is really common, right? So, like, let's take a look at the other two excerpts. I mean, the second...
Did you recognize either of the other two excerpts?
No, I did not recognize, in fact, any of the
Mm-hmm.
excerpts that KENSHO played. So the second one, much more kind of laid back, still orchestral, but kind of a little bit maybe less adventurous metrically, and a little bit more just calm overall. But that for me doesn't eliminate any number of possible early 20th century writing, even though harmonically I would place that closer to later 1800s possibly.
Yeah, my guess for that was like 1880 to 1920. The beginning of the excerpt actually, it's like when it started, I thought this might be Rachmaninoff too. But then by the end of it, I thought, it sounds a little bit earlier, maybe still Russian, maybe something like Rimsky-Korsakov or a Borodin, not Borodin, but somewhere in between those two. And what about this third piece, the piano solo piece, which
is beautiful.
It was quite beautiful. I thought that, I know that Liszt was super into the Dies Irae, so I thought, okay, this could maybe be Liszt, but then it's had that romantic sound, but it also tended a little bit impressionistic.
That's right. That's what I was thinking as well.
I think Liszt can encompass that. I mean, he's certainly not an impressionist era composer, but he had so many experiments, was pointing the way in so many directions, so that I'm going to guess Liszt, and he's dead certainly by 1890. So my number that I put on that piece was 1875.
Okay, so I think I'm comfortable accepting your Liszt fingering. So earlier for that one possibly, and then what do you think about whether the second or the first excerpt is earlier?
I think my chronological from early to late of these three excerpts is 3-2-1.
Yeah, the backwards. That's sort of where instinctively that I went as well. So shall we lock in that chronology?
I'm locking in. Yeah, let's see what happens.
All right, KENSHO, give it to us.
All right, so I am going to do this a certain way. We're going to go from the latest, which is, in fact, clip number 1.
Yes, all right, Tiff. We're off to a good start.
The year was 1936, and it was Rachmaninoff's Third Symphony.
Oh, damn it.
So that is the latest one. Now, going backwards now, a little bit earlier, 43 years earlier was clip number 3.
43 years, okay. So which means that 2 was even earlier than that, which is awesome.
So what I played for you, clip number 3 was Johannes Brahms, Intermezzo, Opus 118, number 6.
Ooh, wow, Tiff.
What?
We were fully unmanned here. Unbelievable.
Very late Brahms, 1893, so just 4 years before his death.
Dang, I know some of the intermezzi as well.
So do I, but there's a lot of them. And as is known to our listeners by now, the way to totally, pwn us on any of these games is to play piano repertoire.
That's so true. The three of us being string players.
Oh, so gorgeous.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And now the earliest one was from 1885, and this is the very end of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony, which I think is a grossly underrated
Wow,
symphony.
gosh, another piece that I would claim to know, but apparently, I don't.
So there you have it, 1885 Tchaikovsky, and then 1893 Brahms, 1936 Rachmaninoff, all using some form of Dies Irae.
Wow. Okay, Kensho, well, you won this one.
You win.
Alrighty, well that was fun. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, so we invite you to try to stump us. Check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, it's time to go down to the laboratory for a bit of musical dissection.
Okay, with our scalpels and bone saws in hand, it's time to take an in-depth look at a genuine Halloween classic, the Danse Macabre of Camille Saint-Saëns. Composed in 1874, this tone poem has become a staple of October concerts in the US, to the point that some people now find it trite, but we think that by digging into the sinews and entrails, we'll find just how interesting this piece is as a composition. So, let me throw it out to Kensho and Will. What are your associations? Do you have special memories associated with the piece? And what are the remarkable features of it for you?
Well, I certainly remember playing this when I was in high school, like in orchestra, and it's so much fun. I mean, like, what better piece? It's so tuneful, it's so fun, it's so fully orchestrated, it's got a very clear set of melodies that are laid out in terms of the form and everything. So it's really easy to hold on to, so I understand why it's such a popular piece.
Yeah, and it's not too long either, which I think is, it has a specific theme. You have these images that, if you know them before, then there's no way you're ever going to dissociate them from the piece. And that's the hallmark of, like, great programmatic writing, right? Like, there's no dissociation between the content and the music itself.
Like Will, I had my first experience with this piece in high school, and I got a chance to play the solo part for this. And so it was the first time, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but it was the first time I had to retune my instrument. And so that kind of messed with my head a little bit. I remember when I was young trying to figure that out. My other memory of this is that we, when I was still the assistant conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, obviously, this is a piece that came up a lot in some of our Halloween concerts, whether it's a community concert or a family concert for kids. And we had a moment where we usually dress up on Halloween. And I remember Juliet Kang, our first associate concertmaster, came out wearing a pizza costume. So I remember her playing this incredibly well, with like these giant kind of like Mickey Mouse gloves.
Wow.
And like, I don't know, she had cut out a way to like play, her left hand was like cut out so she could, finger the violin and all that. But I was just amazed as to her ability to play dressed as a pizza in this technically demanding piece.
Let's talk a little bit about the genre of the piece. So we called it a tone poem earlier, and the tone poem is essentially a through-composed, non-movement broken piece of symphonic music. Would you guys, is there anything else that you want to add to that definition?
And it usually follows some kind of narrative, right? Like there's some kind of story attached to it.
That's right. And I think, for me, the tone poem as a genre is so broad, but it demonstrates at this point how the very delineations of genre of orchestral music we're starting to break down anyway. People are like, what are these like kind of movement formats that we always follow, this 4-movement symphonic thing? Maybe I don't feel like taking a break in between movements. Maybe I just feel like having different content be side by side. And also maybe I feel like writing music that speaks to a program. So we have programmatic symphonies that arise like Symphonie Fantastique, and then we start having other shorter pieces where people are like, maybe I don't necessarily want to write a 50-minute symphony on a programmatic subject.
And, it's funny that we mentioned Liszt earlier, Franz Liszt, because Liszt is often credited as being kind of the father of, or developing this concept of a tone poem.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting juncture, and it shows a lot of kind of the philosophical seams of music history as it was developing in the middle 19th century. What about the content? So there's kind of specific story elements. While we're on the topic of program music, there's very specific images associated with particular events in this piece. So, Will, do you want to take us through the greatest hits here?
Well, I think that, we have to kind of look back because the Danse Macabre is something from Middle Ages folklore. It's this idea that death comes for all. So in the Middle Ages, you would see these tapestries or wood cuttings or other paintings that depict traditionally a pope, an emperor, a king, a child, and a peasant. And the idea is that, you can gain as much as you want from earthly riches, but in the end, death, the grim reaper, comes with his scythe and mows down one and all. So then this kind of got transmogrified a little bit throughout history, so that by the time that Saint-Saëns is writing this piece, the idea is that on All Hallows Eve, all of these different dead people come up from their graves and they dance this round dance in the cemetery. So, and supposedly that even gives us this tradition that we have of Halloween, of people dressing up as different figures. You might dress up as the peasant or the pope or the emperor or something like that.
Let's talk a little bit about this. You were talking, KENSHO, you mentioned tuning your violin down. So what exactly is happening there at the beginning with that violin solo?
So the technical term that we use in the string world is scordatura. And this just means that the regular tuning of the instrument is adjusted in some way. So in this particular piece in the Danse Macabre, the violin solo is asked to tune their E string, which is the highest pitched string on the instrument, down 1/2 step. So it just creates a different sound when you play the strings without fingering any of them.
So just to make it abundantly clear to our listeners how different that this tuning makes it, here's a normal violin sound from the beginning. That's what it sounds like. But the effect of the detuning is that the top note is lowered a 1/2 step. And so the jarring interval that this creates between the top two strings is called a tritone.
In the Middle Ages, this was considered such a dissonant sound that it was called the diabolis in musica, the devil in music. So that is obviously why Camille Saint-Saëns is using it in this work.
Yeah, let's talk for a second about the archetype of like the devil and fiddling. It's such a tight association that starts as early as I think like the 1600s.
Continues right down through the devil going down to Georgia.
Yeah, all the way up to now, and it's funny. I mean, I thought I was trying to find before our recording today, but I was trying to find this list that I saw a couple of years ago of the ranking of all orchestral instruments by how devilish or how heavenly their association was, and I think the violin was right up. I mean, I think the violin was actually at the top of the list.
I think that partially the association of the violin and the devil is bolstered by the historical figure of Niccolo Paganini.
Absolutely, who was a virtuoso violinist and composer who reportedly sold his soul to the devil so that he could play all these impossibly difficult passages that he wrote for himself.
So in this piece, we have the tolling of the bell that starts the piece, which is the harp. And then we have the violin solo, which we've already discussed. And then we have another color that I think it gets so entwined with the image of the skeleton because of the bones, this percussive color of the xylophone.
Right. Right, and I think it's interesting to say at this point that, this piece from 1874 is one of the earliest uses of the xylophone in a European orchestra. I mean, the instrument had really only made its way over to Europe quite recently. There are versions of it found in Eastern Africa and also in the South Pacific Islands. So it's an instrument that grows out of the tradition of the gamelan orchestras in Indonesia. And so then a lot of those Pacific Islander people came over via Madagascar into Africa, and that's how the instrument gets into the African continent. And then I believe it's from Africa where European composers found it and brought it back and started to incorporate it. But yeah, it's such an interesting, we think of the orchestra as being this European institution, and yet, so many of the instruments come from the Middle East or from China or even from Africa and Southeast Asia.
So let's listen to a segment of the middle of this tone poem. We talked a lot about the beginning. There's a segment in the middle where it becomes fugal, and by that we mean that there's a subject that's introduced and it's taken up by various other members of the orchestra and kind of transformed, and it all kind of merges into this big tapestry. So let's just listen to that for a second. Will, as our resident composer, would you like to dig into this fugue, this example of a symphonic fugue?
Well, it goes very much by standard issue in terms of that, like, it starts with the lowest voice and then the higher voices enter one at a time. They are separated by the interval of a fifth. This is very typical contrapuntal technique that goes back to Bach. What do you guys think?
Whenever I see a fugue that's post-Bach, I just see it as a composer showing off how good they are.
It's just skills. A flex by late 19th century composers who've gone to conservatoire.
Well, it's almost seen as you have to pay homage or show that you have your stuff before you can go and do what you actually want to do. Can we also talk about the fact that the Dies Irae crops up in its own incarnation in this section? And listeners, if you didn't catch it, it's in the winds, and it goes yum bum 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 bum, and of course what you're listening for is bum 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 bum, those four notes, and then of course he develops it in his own way. But it's very cool that it's super integral to the actual music. Like, it wouldn't make any sense without it, to be honest.
It's very subtle. You could miss it so easily. It just goes by, and because it's in major, you're not like your ears aren't primed to hear it.
Yeah, I admit to having had to scroll back and be like, wait, really? Okay, yeah. And so that's, amazing example of yet again this theme that crops up again and again. To wrap up our segment here, we should talk about how much this piece has gotten reused itself in pop culture and pop content of the present day. KENSHO, can you think of anything recent that used it?
Well, I want to say two things. First, one, recent, and one maybe not as recent. So what I love about this is that this Danse Macabre also is reused by Saint-Saëns himself in his Carnival of the Animals, right? The fossils movement, we were talking about the xylophone. The xylophone comes back playing the theme of the Danse Macabre in Carnival of the Animals. So he reused it himself. And then more recently, I was watching the Netflix show Ratched, which is the kind of prequel series for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I enjoyed the show, and also the theme music for this is very much straight up the Danse Macabre. But
if you keep your ears peeled this Halloween season, you are certain, I'm not even going to say, 99% likely, I'm going to say you are certain to hear references to this piece, to the Dies Irae. So yeah, happy Halloween. Now that we've completed our dissection and stitched up all the sutures, Will, what do we have next?
Caitlin Doughty is a New York Times best-selling author, mortician, and deathfluencer. In her books and on her YouTube channel, Ask a Mortician, Doughty explores topics relating to human mortality, the macabre, and the multiplicity of approaches to mourning and ritual that human societies have adopted around the world. her goal being to help people everywhere understand, respect, and cope with death, and in so doing, to live richer, fuller lives. One of Caitlin's most popular videos is a 2018 entry in her iconic corpse series titled Haydn's Head. Let's listen to a clip.
It's May of 1809, and Joseph Karl Rosenbaum really wants Joseph Haydn's skull. Haydn is the greatest composer in all of Austria at the time. He's still wildly influential to this day. Rosenbaum, his friend, is an accountant. But by night, Rosenbaum was obsessed with music, theater, and phrenology, or skull reading. Rosenbaum and many others believed that one could divine the source of a person's genius by examining the size, shape, and bumps of the skull. The skulls of musical geniuses like Mozart, Beethoven, and of course our old pal Haydn were especially interesting to phrenologists. So, as Haydn is wasting away, dying, and it becomes clear that his head may soon become available, Rosenbaum starts making preparations to get Haydn's head. It's because of Rosenbaum's obsession, as well as the bonkers story of what Haydn's head went through, that today we honor Joseph Haydn, iconic corpse.
It is a great honor to have Caitlin Doughty with us today on the Classical Spookfest, and a special pleasure for me because Caitlin happens to be one of my dearest friends. Caitlin, welcome to the podcast.
I am so happy to be here. Huge fan of the pod.
Well, we are all big fans of yours, and let's get this party started. Tell us about Haydn's Head. What is this crazy story about this great composer after he died?
This is one of my favorite iconic corpse stories of all time. So you probably know this more than I do. Haydn, to my understanding, was a BFD, was a real big deal in the Austrian composing scene of the 19th century. And Haydn has this friend named Joseph Rosenbaum. And Joseph Rosenbaum is just an accountant, but he is obsessed with Haydn. He loves Haydn, and he's a phrenologist, which, as you probably know, was this 19th century pseudo quackery where you feel the bumps on someone's skull. And that lets you figure out their personality and why he was such a musical genius. And Joseph Rosenbaum wants Haydn's head, and he's going to do everything he can to get it after Haydn dies. So he's working on this secret defleshing technique, and he pays a gravedigger to give him the head of this Viennese actress who died in childbirth. And they try the defleshing technique, and it doesn't quite work. The skull is a little too brittle. It's growing algae, but they learn a lot on this first go. So when Haydn himself finally dies, given the politics of the time, there wasn't a big funeral for him. He kind of just is discreetly buried, which of course allows Joseph Rosenbaum to swoop in, hire the same gravedigger to dig up Haydn's head, decapitate him. He goes to pick it up at the cemetery. Haydn has been dead for about a week in the hot, humid Viennese summer. So he gets his head, he gets into the carriage, opens up the parcel with the head, and it smells so intensely that he just throws up in the carriage. And he takes a month to deflesh the head, and Rosenbaum is able to actually just keep Haydn's skull in this beautiful box in his home for something like 11 years. But eventually, Prince Esterhazy realizes that they hadn't given Haydn a funeral befitting his station. So they decide to exhume him and bring him to the royal crypt. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, they realize that there's just a wig in there. There's a wig and a missing head.
Wait, is that for real?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was just the wig and the body.
So they buried people in the perukes that they would have worn, like, stylishly in the court.
Yes, that's part of the story, is that it was just a wig with a missing head. And so they start to try and figure out where this head could possibly be. And, you know, Rosenbaum hadn't been entirely subtle about this. So there were all these kind of little arrows pointing to him having it. But he, of course, does not want to give it back. So he gives the authorities a head of a totally random other man that he happened to have. This goes okay for a while, but they notice that this head is of a much younger man. And he takes it and he's just like, oh, my bad. And they're like, okay, no problem. Thanks for giving it back. This is my favorite part. Once they realize that it's the skull of a younger man, they're like, sorry, Rosenbaum, we're coming to get the head. And he does not want to give it up so badly that he puts his wife in bed, puts the skull in bed with her, and tells the police she is menstruating and cannot be disturbed. And it works. They're like, oh, we cannot disturb that woman in her menstrual bed. So we can't search in there. And then he gives them yet another skull that is not Haydn, that is another like older man's skull, more matching Haydn. Mm-hmm. And they don't figure it out. They bury that body and that wig with that head that is not Haydn. And I think it wasn't until 150 years after his death in 1954 that they finally reunite Haydn's actual skull with his body, but they didn't know who that other skull belongs to. So Haydn is now buried with two skulls. And that is the story of the adventure of Haydn's head.
So who had the head in the intervening 150 years?
In the intervening 100 years, there was another man named Johann Peter who was kind of Rosenbaum's accomplice in this that had the head for a while. They had like sort of joint custody situation,
right?
Like a dog after a breakup.
Every other weekend, yeah, sure.
Exactly. And he actually had Haydn's skull in the garden at some point, which I think is kind of weirdly charming. And then it went to like a musical society where it sat on a piano. And it was interesting that it kind of just got to exist there. And because enough time had passed, presumably, everyone was like, oh yeah, it's an open secret. Everyone knows it's Haydn's head, but they're not going to do anything about it until finally it caught up with them and they had to turn it over.
Wow. What a wild story.
What are your relationships with Haydn?
Haydn is considered the father of two genres of music. Haydn is the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet. And so Haydn wrote 108 symphonies. There's some debate about that. Some people say 104, some people say 106.
It's a good number.
How many do people usually write?
9.
9, okay.
9 is the sweet spot, yeah.
Yeah, 9. So
after that, you normally die.
Yeah, right. Hey, that's a fun topic for today too. Is that like the curse of the ninth? Basically, Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies and then he died, and then after him, everybody was afraid of writing their 9th symphony because they thought that they were going to die. Many composers it happened to. Dvorak wrote 9 symphonies, then he died. Bruckner he didn't even finish writing his 9th symphony. He was 3/4 of the way through and then he died. My boy, Alfred Schnittke, wrote his 8th symphony, had a stroke, was pronounced clinically dead, came back from the dead, could only write with his left hand, and he scribbled out his 9th symphony. It took a musicologist 10 years to decipher after he had done that. So the curse of the ninth is a very real thing. KENSHO, what's your relationship with Haydn symphonies?
You get these questions like, Desert Island, what do you bring? And one of the things on my list has always been like the Haydn string quartets and 3 other people that I can play with. It's like the things that I want to take with me. So, I mean, the string quartets are very dear to me and I really enjoy listening to them, playing them. And it's just one of those things that are very close to me.
Do you fight over the first violin part or the second violin part?
Or the viola part, right? Don't knock the viola parts. But no, I'm more partial, I guess, to the inner voices. So it's usually a second violin part.
What about you, Tiff? What's your relationship with Haydn?
Right now, it's the season in which I'm teaching my music appreciation class, and we're right in smack dab in the middle of the classical era. So this is kind of conveniently timed for us. And the fact that in the classical era, you can tell people, Mozart and Haydn, which we've played a couple games on by this point, it's hard to overstate how large of a shadow. I mean, people talk about Beethoven's shadow, over the symphony and onwards after his time. But I think Haydn's shadow is actually probably greater in terms of how much he formalized the genres that he wrote for.
So would you jump at the chance to get your hands on Haydn's skull if you could?
Jump. Possibly. Rob a grave, maybe not.
Wow, you're such a moral paragon, Tiffany.
That was a question that was popping up in my mind, though, when I was listening to the story or watching the video, was how many patrons of classical music right now would love to get their hands on a skull of a composer or a musician that's living right now? Like, how many people do you think would be very interested in procuring themselves a skull of
Haydn? A lot.
No, but even like composers of today, right? Like,
Nobody would care about composers of today. What the hell are you talking about? But if Haydn's skull came up for auction, like at Sotheby's, I wonder how much money it would go for.
Well, that's kind of what makes the story interesting, I think, is that even with all the like puking in the carriage and the defleshing process and the first failed skull and in the menstrual bed, it's a understandable impulse somehow. Like, this man was such a huge fan and I sort of wonder what their friendship was really like. Was it like kind of a one-way relationship where Joseph Rosenbaum was like, we're best friends, like Will has with me, where he thinks we're great friends, but It's actually kind of more of a fan relationship.
They're hanging out and he's like suddenly like rubbing his head.
Exactly. Yeah. He comes up behind me and like gently fingers my head. It's sort of understandable that if you believe that you can learn about genius from the skull, which he really did, he believed in phrenology. He believed that by rubbing the head, you could learn something about why this man Haydn was such a profound genius and probably was so prolific, as you said. I think the impulse like kind of becomes clear. Like it becomes not like morbid or sad or weird. It's sort of just understandable.
Wait, I have a question, Caitlin. Like, how recognizable is a person's skull? Let's say Haydn's skull had just been swapped with one that was not of a much younger man. Let's say it had just been swapped with another old Austrian guy's skull. Would somebody who had known Haydn in life, do you think, be able to look at the skull and say like, no, I don't think so. That's not what my bro Franz looked like?
There are obviously people who are experts who can reconstruct entirely what a person looks like from their skull, which is where you get those forensic drawings or renderings of someone and what they look like in life. I really think the only way to tell is someone's teeth. It's probably even easier back then because everyone now just has braces, so everyone's teeth kind of look the same. But I imagine at that time, everyone probably had very distinct wonky teeth in their own unique way. So if he did, it's possible that someone who really knew him would be like, that's not like Haydn had, his molar was like way out to the side. That's not him.
So we wanted to talk about some other weird classical music deaths from history. In particular, there's this Jean-Baptiste Lully. He died in a pretty spectacular way, and it was due to an injury sustained while performing music from the conductor's podium. Can you tell us anything about this?
Well, this is actually a question I had for you. He slammed his own foot with his conducting staff. And I want to know what a conducting staff is.
What I've learned about this case, let's say, is that the conducting staff was something where the conductor would actually make an audible sound, right, by beating the floor with the staff to keep everybody in tempo. So it was it's akin to like clapping very loudly.
That seems like kind of the vibe. Let's do this. I like that. So he missed, unfortunately, which is why maybe it went out of fashion because of the huge probability of death using one. But he hit his foot, and I presume he crunched an artery or just did something because he got gangrene on his foot. And gangrene, as you probably know, is when a part of your body, it happens most often in the most extremities like feet and fingers, does not get blood flow for some reason. So by slamming his conducting staff into his foot, he managed to sever blood flow to his toes and his lower foot. And gangrene is when you are basically rotting alive, or that part of your body is rotting alive. And when one part of your body starts rotting, it can spread. And I believe that they wanted him to amputate the foot or the leg, but he didn't want to do that because he wanted to dance.
Well, do you know why he wanted to dance?
No.
Is because he and the Sun King Louis XIV, they were like gay lovers. And one of their big hobbies together was to dance in the royal court ballet.
Oh, and so he just wanted to keep dancing with his lover at the court. And so he refused to have his leg amputated, but that meant that the gangrene and the necrotic fasciitis just spread up his leg, and he started rotting alive, and then he died.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's kind of romantic, I guess.
It is. I feel like, again, it's almost like understandable. Like, he just wanted to dance, man.
KENSHO has an interesting story about a weird composer death.
Yeah, so I read this fact in preparing many of the pre-concert lectures that I was preparing when I was an assistant conductor. And Ernest Chausson was a French composer, died at the age of 44 in a bicycle accident. He lost control of his bicycle and crashed into a brick wall. So that was one way of going out.
Yeah, so when someone says like they hit a wall in their creative process, he unfortunately literally hit a wall.
Okay, so now that we've talked about some classical music history and some great composers who had weirdo deaths, I thought that we might listen to some great music about death. So the first thing that we're going to listen to is some old music. This actually would have been from around the time of Lully. This is music by Henry Purcell, English composer, who himself was somebody who died quite young. This is his music for the death of Queen Mary. All right, Caitlin, reactions. Purcell, music for the death of Queen Mary.
I love it. I was a little known fact about me. I was a taiko drummer for a year.
No.
Well,
way.
Caitlin's a Hawaiian.
I am from
citizen.
Hawaii,
Yeah.
but I did this in Los Angeles, and I absolutely loved it, and I had to stop it for geographic reasons, and it broke my heart. But I associate passion-filled drumming with not only my sort of favorite music, but music that makes you really feel something. And I think just having that like solo drummer just banging his heart out, I associate it with grief, and I think it's lovely.
I just love the fact that you said that the drumming is like an expression of grief, because I was actually thinking one thing that we didn't talk about in terms of our genre is the obsession with requiems. So composers writing their own requiems, and I was just thinking about the Verdi Requiem and the use of the bass drum. And to me, like that was usually like an expression of like the intensity or the drama of death than like a musician expressing grief by drumming. So that was an interesting kind of different angle to hearing the drumming for me.
Well, speaking of drumming, there's some more drumming in this next clip that we're going to listen to. This is also by a composer who died very young. This is Lily Boulanger, one of my all-time favorites. She died in 1918 at the age of 24. And it's a really tragic death because the world was laid out in front of her. She was the first woman to win the Prix de Rome in 1914, 16, something like this. And she just had so many milestones that she passed. And she was writing music of unparalleled brilliance. I mean, she was right up there with Stravinsky and Debussy and Ravel at the pinnacle of Parisian music in the 1910s. But this piece is the Pour les funérailles d'un soldat, for the funeral of a soldier. And many people think that it's her reaction to World War I, but in a way it's her prediction of World War I. This piece comes from 1913. Caitlin, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'd be interested. It just makes me want to know more about this thing that I've never really thought about, like as you were saying, Kensho, like what it means to write requiems. And most of the composers from this period, were they writing more about the concept of death, or were they writing more about their own deaths? And what does it mean to reflect that in a whole piece of music?
No, the composers thought about their own deaths. Like, we have robust evidence, right? I mean, let's go back maybe to how the number 9 became kind of an obsession for some composers who could not stop thinking about how once their creative output had ended, that would mean the end of their life. Mahler is the one who comes to mind, who was like so paranoid about the number 9, he actually circled around and wrote number 10 before.
It's like when they take the 13th floor, they don't label the 13th floor in hotels 13, and you're like, we all know it's the 13th floor. Come on.
Yeah, and I don't know examples necessarily. I don't know, maybe Will or Kensho, are any requiems come to mind right off the bat where you knew that composers were consciously writing like their own funeral music?
Apparently Salieri, of all people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, wrote his own requiem. Mm-hmm.
One of Mozart's contemporaries and some will say competitors.
Yeah, especially if they've seen the movie Amadeus.
Yeah, that's good. That's my reference. Yeah, what is so I know about Salieri Mozart from that movie, but if you're a real deep in the classical music world, are you like just don't even mess with Salieri, or what's like the real tea on him?
You know, his music does not get performed very much. There are a few specialists who do some of his operas and maybe occasionally some of the overtures or, you know, a symphony here or there. But no, Salieri has really not made it through the filter of history very well.
And then furthermore, I think that the movie like did quite a lot to kind of demonize him as an actual like dramatic character, because there's really no evidence of like true animosity between the two of them. I mean, of course, they competed for business because that was what the milieu they lived in was one of patronage, and you need people to pay you to write stuff, but there's no evidence at all beyond professional competition, I would say, that they had an acrimonious relationship.
Yeah, because I thought it was like Joan Crawford and Betty Davis of the time.
Okay, let's listen to a third thing here. This is a contemporary piece. This is music by the British composer Thomas Adès. This is from Thomas Adès's Totentanz. This is his portrayal of the Middle Ages Danse Macabre, of the Dance of Death. What's interesting in there, Caitlin, is that the figure of death is depicted as like this sort of, you know, skeleton playing a flute. And so that's one thing why we hear all of these, you know, piccolos and flutes in there.
I did like death as piccolo because if you're familiar with the art of the Danse Macabre of the late Middle Ages, it is saying that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, old or young, death is essentially the Pied Piper leading you away from life, and that we're all equal in death. So I like death being portrayed as kind of almost like a puckish character, fluting you away to your untimely demise, and nothing can save you no matter what.
So for the final portion of our interview today, Caitlin, we wanted to ask you a few more general questions. Death and dying and rituals surrounding death are a topic that a lot of people have a kind of instinctive negative reaction towards. It's something that they don't want to deal with, that they want to look away from, that sort of grosses them out maybe. And I would say that there is some portion of the populace who feels an instinctive negative reaction when the subject of classical music comes up. So you have, against all odds, sort of built this huge popular following about death and dying and sort of getting people comfortable with this idea and bringing them into this perspective that you have. So what can we in the world of classical music learn from you and your great success in this regard?
I think they're actually similar in the sense that it has been the work of marketers in the 20th into the 21st century to convince us that these old ways are bad. to sell us new things, they have to convince us that like the simple pleasures of yesteryear are actually bad or unsafe or not what we really need. And that definitely is what happened in the funeral industry. And I think it's sort of what happened with classical music too. I grew up with the same narrative most people have, which is that this is old, this is fuddy-duddy, it's not the music of now. And that marketing has been very impactful and very good. But we're also entering a period where people are interested in less. And that's not really what's being reflected in music, but even just the fact that classical music is analog seems so important to me, and seems to be really, really in keeping with the idea of like using less soap, using less plastic, using less, emissions, using less everything in one's life, minimalism, and going back to just that kind of simple experience of directly experiencing music seems like a really amazing opportunity for classical music.
And speaking of death, do you want music at your funeral? And if so, what would that be?
Well, after our conversation today, I think taiko drums is what I want at my funeral. Although I will take, if Will wants to do like a weird, like Schnittke, like extravaganza, I think that would also, to score my death experience, I think that would also go down really well. So I'm gonna leave it to Will. I'm gonna leave Will in my will for music.
As I have left you in my will for just like figuring the whole thing out.
For just dealing with your corpse.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Caitlin, aside from Haydn's head, do you have a relationship with classical music?
I feel actually like I am probably the customer that you want right now, because I am looking to slow down my life, to slow down and sit with a piece of music in a different way that I have before. We've been listening to more classical music just in the pandemic in my home, but I would love for you to recommend me a couple pieces that I just have to sit with and be present with.
Speaking of recommendations, would you be willing to stick around and recommend something for this week's classical mixtape?
Oh, I thought you would never ask. I have one. I'm ready. Put me in, coach.
So now we'll move on to our classical mixtape segment, in which we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So let's start with our guest of honor, Caitlin. What do you have for us this week?
Thank you. So this, credit where it's due, my boyfriend's aunt is one of the classical DJs on the San Francisco classical radio station.
Whoa.
And we texted her and asked her for a whole range of recommendations for music that combines, classical and death. And I listened to them all. Another positive, engaging classical music afternoon. So the piece that I picked was Kindertotenlieder by Mahler, or Songs on the Death of Children. And the reason that I picked it is because the story goes that Mahler started to write this piece 2 weeks after the birth of his child, and his wife was like, "Oh no, you are not tempting fate like this. I know you are not about to write this piece." And sure enough, at age 4, his daughter died of scarlet fever, and his wife allegedly never forgave him.
Wenn dein Mütterlein tritt zur Tür herein und den Kopf nicht drehe, wir entgegen sehen.
The poem that he based it on is incredibly sad. If you read the translation, it's really quite beautiful and quite sad, and it's all about missing the corporal form of the child, of looking to where the child is supposed to be, and it's just missing, and the feeling that creates.
Thanks so much. Excellent recommendation. Will, you're up next.
All right, my spooky piece of music for this spooktacular episode is a piece by the Estonian composer Veljo Tormis, and this is called Curse Upon Iron. It's for a cappella choir and shaman drum, and it is based off of pagan rituals from ancient Karelia or someplace like this. It's supposed to evoke a very, very old mystic ritual. about forging a new sword from iron and like casting a magic spell upon it. I have to recommend that our listeners watch the music video that was made in the 1980s where they dramatized this event. It is one of the all-time most amazing music videos. However, having said that, I also have to recommend that our listeners watch the performance that we've just listened to, which is the Nederlands Kamerkoor, as conducted by Tonio Kaljuste, who himself is an Estonian musician, a great conductor, where he is playing the shaman drum. As it's sort of like what we were talking about with Lully banging the staff. It's a very intense piece of music, and it's super creepy, and yeah, that's my recommendation.
Okay, on that note, let's go to KENSHO for his recommendation.
I recently conducted a piece about a year ago by a living Japanese composer called Toshio Hoskawa. And this is a piece called Voyage X. And it features a Japanese instrument that is basically an ancient flute that dates back to like the 7th century called the shakuhachi. And it's a traditional Japanese instrument that I was not very familiar with until I performed with a professional shakuhachi player. But basically, it's an ancient instrument that's made of bamboo, and you blow into it. It looks like a recorder, so it's a longitudinal flute. And it produces some of the most like atmospheric, eerie sounds that I have ever heard. And listening to a recording of it doesn't quite match to the experience of having it right next to you and being played live. But this piece, while it's not intended to be spooky or Halloween-y, I thought would really work well with the atmosphere of this Halloween spooktacular episode.
Really spooky, KENSHO. Thanks so much for that. To wrap up our mixtape segment today, I'd like to recommend a piece that I have actually a little bit of guilt in being so enamored of, but this was one of my kind of angsty teenager loves, and this is a piece called Totentanz, which, as we've seen from our Odyss earlier, translates as Dance of Death, and it's by Franz Liszt, and it's a piano concerto. It's a showpiece, as all of Liszt's piano pieces are, but it incorporates the Dies Irae in a major way. And I just find this one of the most rock out piano pieces that I've ever heard, and I was totally into it as an undergrad.
I'm imagining, Tiffany, you sitting there with a clove, smoking a clove with dark black eyeliner, and you're just like, oh, I'm such a teenage classical goth.
Guilty as charged. Well, maybe not with the eyeliner, but you know what I mean. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Spookfest. I'm Willy's White, and on behalf of Tiffany Boo and Kensho Watanabe, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, scary listening, and we'll be with you next week.
During which you'll be very glad that we'll have put Will back in his coffin.
Willy's.
We'll have put Willy's back in his coffin.